Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name's Tony Mason and welcome to another social history chat at Heathlands at Home. Today we're going to centre on principally the city of Carlisle and its industrial heritage, if you like. We're going to talk about a few things which perhaps we haven't covered in the past when we've looked at Carlisle. And also we're going to be looking at some of the industries that Carlisle is famous for, and perhaps some that we now no longer have, and also some people who were around in those times. We will get up to speed and up to date with modern Carlisle as such. We have some of the original newspapers from 2005, and anybody who was around in 2005 in Carlisle will know that was when we had the Great Flood, and then of course Desmond 15 years later. So what we're going to look at first is there's a map here of Carlisle basically, and you have the River Eden here. Then there's the Eden Bridge there, labelled as the A7, if you'll notice, as was the major road into Scotland before the M6. And obviously you've got the castle here, yeah, and the dark lines round here is the surviving bits and where the medieval part of Carlisle was. So coming up from the Citadel down by the railway station, up Lowther Street, and then along Rickergate, which is obviously now much changed, and then along to the castle. So this line here is medieval Carlisle. Okay, there's the Irish Gate, where the Carlisle Bridge is, the River Carlisle running along here. You've got the Tithe Barn, St Cuthbert's, the Refectory, Cathedral, obviously castle, and then you have the two citadels here. Carlisle didn't change very much for hundreds and hundreds of years. It remained very much in that sort of triangular shape, if you like. The other areas were more or less built on as the Industrial Revolution took a pace, and so the population of Carlisle was centred around this area. You've still got Castle Street and Fisher Street, English Street, Scotch Street, Abbey Street, of course, and you can still walk along the west walls. The walls are still in remarkable condition. I don't know of many cities, Derry perhaps is one, but there are not many cities where you can actually drive along the city walls. There is a road, a one-track road, which moves along here, but you can walk, and it looks right across the Caldew, right across into Dixon's Chimney, and eventually into the Colbeck Fells. Good vantage points for spotting any armies that may be coming, and obviously secured by people having to cross the Caldew. The Caldew, one of the fastest running rivers in England, was ideal for mill power, which we will touch upon. And in fact, the Little Caldew, as locals will know, runs from the bay all the way to the River Eden at Willahome, and actually powered numerous mills and wheels along the way. Higginson Mill, Dixon's Chimney Mill, etc., etc. But we'll come on to that in a moment. In 1257, most of Carlisle was destroyed by fire. I would assume, therefore, that obviously the castle would be all right, and the cathedral, which has seen many interesting times and many interesting changes, not least to itself. So I would imagine that some of these buildings would possibly be okay, but it was destroyed. Rickergate, it says, was destroyed by fire, as was much the eastern part of the city, including the Moot Hall, which were kept the city's original charters. And it's reported that the king at the time gave 200 oaks from the royal forest at Inglewood to the people of Carlisle to enable them to rebuild their homes. It's very interesting that prior to Rufus, who was the son of William the Conqueror, coming to Carlisle around about 1096, things are very hazy as to what happened from the Romans leaving to the Normans appearing and building a castle. There was obviously a site of wooden construction here before the Normans came, but the Normans were always built in stone, predominantly. So the time between the Romans leaving in 410, 420, and the Normans rocking up 600 years, 650 years later is very hazy. We know that Carlisle was at one time part of Scotland. We know this because Edward I came up to Carlisle and reclaimed part of it because it had moved back and forth in the time from when the Normans first came here. In 685 we have a report that St Cuthbert visited and was shown Roman fountains. So this is 200 and 300 years after the Romans left. There's still a working Roman fountain in Carlisle. We had Reged, which was a British kingdom which went from all the way at Stranraer all the way down to South Lancashire and beyond. Basically anything on the western side of the Pennines. And there were Viking incursions and raids. There is talk of Romano-Celt peoples living in and around the borders, Byrd Oswald. There's even reports of the legendary King Arthur, but I don't think Arthur, personally, I don't think Arthur was a king. I think he was more a warlord for hire with his troop of horsemen. But that's for another day. Let's look at some of the things in Carlisle, and let's look at an image which is quite interesting. We'll just find this image, and I want to show you because it's an image I hadn't seen until just very recently. And we'll just move Carlisle out of the map there. And just to show you how things do change in Carlisle. Believe it or not. There we are. These are the citadels which we showed at the bottom of medieval Carlisle. And just to prove that things in Carlisle do change, here's one of the citadels, and these are the tram lines which ran all the way down to Warwick Road and onward down Botchergate. This is all to preserve of traffic now, of course, but these were laid down in September 1899, and a lot of photographs around this time at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th century feature Carlisle's tram lines. They lasted approximately 65, 67, nearly 70 years. If you go down Botchergate and past where Halfords is, opposite Halfords, those were the tram sheds, from what I'm led to believe. But you can see here, there's the Crescent, and there's one of Henry VIII's citadels, which he built well, not personally, of course, and these are the tram lines. This was to help workers get to work, essentially, and moving around the city. And it helped that you had merchants, butchers, shoemakers, tailors, smiths, skinners, weavers and tanners in Carlisle. Why did we have so many occupations of this? Is because people brought their livestock to Carlisle so that so they could sell it. That's why we still have in the H&H Mart at Rose Hill one of the largest auction marts in Western Europe. So a lot of people did a lot of animal husbandry, if you like, and there were jobs linked to it. Being a tanner and a skinner was not really a healthy occupation. You had to use a lot of substances like urine, for example, with tanning to actually make the leather fit for purpose. More substantial houses became the norm in Carlisle around about the start of the 1700s, late 1600s. People decided that they were fed up of having the houses burned down in wood, and Tullie House was built by Thomas Tullie in 1689. Still standing. It's now the city's museum. There are a number of Georgian houses on Abbey Street and Castle Street, and in that quarter of the city. A lot of the industries that came into Carlisle, we can list them. The canal. Carlisle had a canal. Now, why would Carlisle have a canal, do you think? Well, as the crow flies, we're only literally 5 to 8 miles from the sea, although we're actually only 5 miles from the Solway, if the truth was known. So a canal was dug from Carlisle, or from Port Carlisle as it was named, across into Carlisle. And if you go to Tullie House, for example, you will see there are paintings there which show a view from the eastern entrance of Carlisle along Brampton Road, and you can see the castle, you can see where the cricket ground might be, but you can see 3-masted schooners next to what we now know is the Jovial Sailor and Port Road. These names obviously have been around for a couple of 100 years, and they were named as such because that's where the barges and the sloops brought the goods into Carlisle. So what goods were they bringing? They were bringing cotton, principally cotton from the Americas, and it turns out that that's why, for example, a lot of the mills were put up. That's why the mill race, the Little Carlisle, was put in, and as the Carlisle, as we've said, was a fast-moving river. Carlisle made its name as a mill place. So the cotton was coming in from the Americas. You have to send any good merchant, and worth his salt would say, if the boats are coming in, they've got to go out with something. So the mills were making tweed, plaid, as the Americans would call it, and they were making it because the borders was known for this cloth. It was hard wearing, it was warm, it was breathable, and it was waterproof. But they were sending handmade, well, not handmade, they were sending, well, maybe they were handmade in some cases, putting buttons on and things like that would be done by hand. But they were sending them back to America. Now, in Tullie House, in the vaults of Tullie House, there is a board, probably about 4x3, and it has about 9 different tartan patterns on it. A lot of them are sort of a mauve, light straw type colour with a prominent markings in them, whether it's light blue or yellow or whatever. And they were made for all shapes and sizes, all sexes and children. And these were to clothe slaves. So the cotton was coming in to Carlisle, and clothing for slaves was going out to the plantations, and each plantation had its own its own markings, basically. So an owner could walk or ride across a certain area and see that his slaves, if you like, were in his patch. It was almost like a marking of, not a branding as such, but though in some cases it probably was. This is why places like Dixon's Chimney were put together. Dixon's Chimney, built in 1836 by Peter and John Dixon. It's over 300 feet tall, and it was there to make large amounts of clothes from the cotton that came in, as well as exporting tweed out to the Americas. Much of the cloth produced in these mills came from raw cotton, and that came from the States. In 1861, when the American Civil War of Independence broke out between the North and the South, one of which the major players, one of the major antagonistics between the two was basically the rights of man and slavery. This was a major blow to Carlisle's textile industry, and when the Civil War ended in 1865 and slavery was abolished, Carlisle's cotton mills and the industry disintegrated, basically. Sales of gingham collapsed. People didn't want to wear cloth that reminded them of their enforced bondage. Peter and John Dixon were declared bankrupt in 1872. And 16 years later, the mill was turned into a woolen spinning mill. And in 1919 became Linton Tweeds. Textiles weren't the only industry coming around at this time. Carr's Steam Biscuit Factory. And we've got a couple of images I'd like to show you of Carr's Biscuit Factory. Now I'm just going to find it, because the reason why we're showing it is because it'll lead on to something we'll talk about later. But these are two images of Carlisle's Biscuit Factory, 1907 and 1930s. And if I just put those there and hold that down a bit, just to let you know that in this picture here you can see the railways were intrinsically important to the distribution of Carr's Biscuit Factory. So this is, what, 120 years ago, 115 years ago? And here is Carr's Biscuits are made here with their name in lights. Now, this was put in 1931, but you can see a couple of minis down here. So it must have been around for a lot longer than just the 1930s. And in fact, I'm right in thinking that Carr's Biscuits still has its name up in lights, whether it's McVitie's or whatever. But they still do things of that nature. So obviously transport and the links of transport, as we've seen with the canals and the mills, now we've got links between the biscuits and the railways. So there's a lot going on for Carlisle. Why were the railways important? Carlisle has always been, by its very geographical nature, a gateway into Scotland and also a gateway into the south, down the Eden Valley. It's also been an opportunity for people who are coming in from the west to go east to the coalfields of Tyneside, Durham, etc., 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 and the heavy industry that was over there. In fact, the railway between Carlisle and Newcastle is the third oldest in the world. Some of the cuttings, and by that I mean the works that were cut through into the earth, and if are works of industrial marvellousness, if you like. If you go to somewhere like, if you go to Hayton Woods, for example, and near Hayton Woods is the Cowan cutting, which is Joseph Cowan, who was a leading industrialist and MP in the northeast of England, and basically he had, obviously they had to get through Gelt Woods, but they had to lay 2 tracks, and the cutting there is the work that they must have had to do to put this in before machines. A lot of the time, a lot of the work done by navvies, digging by hand and laying the track by hand, must have been monumental and very hard work. But Victorians were never short of progress. The whole ethos of the Victorian industrialist and the Victorian Britain was moving on, change, and in fact, about Victorians, we can now look back and say they actually did some harm to what was originally there in the medieval times before they arrived on the scene, and the Industrial Revolution would happen come hell or high water, and nothing would stand in its way. If you go, for example, if you go to Newcastle Station, the central station, as big a station, if not bigger than the Citadel Station in Carlisle. It's built right on Hadrian's Wall. It's built with the bricks from the city wall, and they had no problems in doing this to their heritage because it was progress. The same could be said of the Normans who built the keep at Carlisle Castle. They used Roman stones. The Roman inscriptions are still in the castle keep. And so consequently, I suppose we could say one era has robbed another of its historical heritage to, in the new progress. I think we're a bit more emancipated in that respect today. The biscuit factory came about, a lot of people will know this, because of John Dodgson Carr, who was a Quaker, and he came to Carlisle to bake biscuits in Shadongate, in Coldiagate. Why? Because the Coldier was there and it ran past his door. Very much like on the other side of the Coldier, you had the brewery. Both needed water for power, and they also needed water for their products. Carlisle's water biscuits. I say no more. He came as a baker in 1831, and because he was a Quaker, he looked after his staff. They were well fed, they were clean, had shoes or boots, and within 20 years they were producing 400 tons of biscuits every year. How do you get those biscuits to market? We're not talking Carlisle's market here. We're talking the Newcastle market, the Edinburgh market, the London market, the Birmingham market. You used trains because trains were there. Just hopping back, possibly 50 years, the canals really only lasted about 40 years tops, because you could travel faster by train. And they weren't as, well, you could travel faster, that and time and speed meant everything to Victorians. They could also carry passengers, but they could also carry freight. You also had Hudson Scott, who developed metal box. If you're going to pack your water biscuits in something in the 1870s, what have you got? You don't have plastics, you don't have cellophane, you might have rice paper if you're lucky. You've got tin boxes with lids, which keeps things longer than leaving them in a paper bag. And so consequently the metal box got together with Carr's biscuits and sent them around the world. Obviously the metal boxes were decorated, so you had artists, you had printers, you had designers. So all these people are all working in Carlisle. They all need to get to work, so we need a tram system, because Carlisle is expanding. If you walk up Newtown Road, and if you get opposite to where some might remember the Green Dragon pub was, but it's halfway up, after the spa shop, after the hospital, before you get to the one-stop shop, and before you get to Shady Grove Road, there was a plaque on a house, and it says, I'll paraphrase, this house was the 2000th house built in the housing scheme in Carlisle in 1922. Not 1946 or 1950, but in 1922. So people were moving out of the small areas of Carlisle and coming into Carlisle from other areas, from surrounding areas for work, and they needed to be housed. A lot of the centre of Carlisle was very, very heavily populated, and a lot of it was slum. And so consequently, if you were going to have a good workforce working for you with Carr's Biscuits who could walk to work or get the tram, we'll build some houses up Newtown Road and up, you can see where we're going. So this is about the time that Botcherby, which was a village in its own right, now became part of Carlisle. Now if we fast forward to 2021, we can see the same is happening again in the sort of the west of Carlisle, as we go across to along the Caldew and out towards Wigton Way in Dalston. So Carlisle moves with the times. It has to. Harrowby is also part of this as well. That was a workforce for Cavies or Cavan and Greys, food production for Marks and Spencer's. Hey ho! So we'll have the estate with the workers living just over the road. So this is Victorian and Edwardian and mid 20th century planning. Get the workforce close to where they are and have a good transport system. Carlisle has 7 railway companies before the Second World War coming through the Citadel station. Brewing, because of the nature of the water coming from Three Rivers, straight off the fells, very good. So the old brewery was set up in 1756 in Caldew Gate. there were other breweries as well, but that was the major one, which eventually became part of the State Management Brewery in 1916. You had St George Richardson's engineering works at St Nicholas, the Cow and Sheldon yards. They made some of the biggest cranes in the world there. Most of them mounted on a railway. Flatbed trucks kind of affair. Sometimes they actually had them on boats, on ships. So there was a lot of skill and a lot of industry in Carlisle, and that allowed the population to increase. We know that the population of Carlisle round about the First World War was round about 50,000, which is approximately half of what it is 100 years later. The population of Carlisle in 1825 was probably around about 30,000, and if we go beyond pre-industrial age, 10,000, if you were lucky. So people moved into Carlisle and worked, made a family. So things moved on. The railways are interesting because Carlisle was a top hat station, and I'm going to show you a photograph as to why Carlisle was called a top hat station. Basically, it was because when you got to Carlisle station and stepped off the platform, you were greeted by the station master in a top hat, and not every station was a top hat station. It meant that you had arrived in a place of importance. You weren't getting off, dare I say it, at Penrith. You weren't getting off at Kendal. You were getting off at Top Hat Station, a main line station. It opened in 1847. So it's been with us now 180 years, which is some deal. So it could move Carlisle's goods and services around the world, the known world, or at least around the British Empire. It was a shame to think about the canal. There's very little of it left now. If you go to the edge of the Western Bypass on the Brough by Sands way, there is a little, what you can see it's in a farmer's field on the right hand side, just past Knockupworth Hall or Knockupworth Farm, and there is a little bridge, and there's no reason for it to be there, but there was obviously a canal river which got filled in, and they actually put a railway on top of it a lot of the time anyway. So the Newcastle and Carlisle Railway opened in 1837. The Maryport and Carlisle Railway Company also opened in 1837, and came in, and everything was authorised. And you could travel first class, second class, third class. So it was open to all, but obviously the further up the class you went, the more you paid. So Port Carlisle Canal disappeared. And in 1876, they had the Midland Railway come up through the Pennines of England, over Settle. I'm sure we all know about the Carlisle Settle line and the viaduct, and that was in 1876. You could arrive in Carlisle by three different ways, by train, by three different companies.